It may have been the greatest army of all time, conquering and controlling an empire that stretched across the ancient Western world. It was ruthless, disciplined, and feared by all, not just by its enemies, who died in their millions, but by its own emperors, who often paid the price of the army's wrath. And yet, these soldiers were builders as well as destroyers, helping to spread a culture that became the bedrock of West. Rule and reshape the classical world. And why did it eventually fall? This is the story of the Roman war machine. For centuries began as early as 1000 BC. Archaeologists have found the remains of dwellings from that period on Rome's Palatine Hill, where many of the system we recognize today. Rome became important matters, including the military, the Latin word meaning conscription. But this was a far cry from the professional Roman army that would later dominate the world.
They are citizen soldiers, they are part-time soldiers, they get recruited for the campaigning season, they leave their fields, their work to go off and fight in the army. At the end of the campaign, they're back, bringing in the harvest, bringing in the vintage, plowing the fields.
Every year, able-bodied Roman men were summoned by trumpet to report for enlistment. But not all men. Only landowners were trusted to fight for Rome because they had something to protect. Service was regarded as a duty and an honor, and a must for any Roman seeking political power.
The Roman people are reluctant to vote for people who cannot show their war wounds. There are many stories of people standing for politics in the forum, ripping their clothes to show their wounds, to demonstrate that they have fought for Rome in battle.
Romans had to provide their own armor and weapons, so the wealthiest, the officers, had a helmet, armor, a spear, a sword, and a shield, while the poorest, the front ranks, had no armor and had only slings and stones for weapons. The early Roman army was modeled on the Greeks, especially the basic tactical formation. The Greek army used the so-called phalanx, a tight-knit, rolling infantry formation which came at the enemy like a forest of spears.
Your whole army lined up, facing forward in lines, and then the first few ranks would hold out their spears and their shields, and the army would move forward en masse. The object was to simply push aside the enemy, and in the course of it, kill as many as possible.
Rome's first major victory was against its old nemesis, the Etruscans, when Rome conquered the nearby city of Veii in 396 BC. But the Romans didn't have long to celebrate. 6 years later, they met an entirely new kind of enemy, when Celtic warriors from the north swept down upon Rome. The Celts were a people linked by language, culture, and style of warfare, and Celtic tribes were spread across Europe, from Ireland to France and Switzerland. In 390 BC, a Celtic army thrashed the Roman legion and overran Rome.
The Celtic method of fighting was very disturbing to them. The Celts simply ran at you with hundreds and thousands of men, yelling, shouting, banging on metal objects, blowing their horns. They really terrified the Romans.
The Celts left the city only after the Romans bribed them with gold. This was Rome's wake-up call. It needed to rethink its whole military strategy if it was to survive, and one way was through training. Roman soldiers had to go through the toughest training in the ancient world. There were 4 long, hard months of basic training, and anyone who couldn't stand the pace was either discharged or put on rations of foul-tasting barley until they got it right. Basic training began with marching, and plenty of it. Soldiers had to be able to march more than 20 miles in 5 hours, carrying a full pack. In weapons training, recruits were given dummy swords, shields, and javelins that weighed twice as much as the real things to build muscles.
The Romans, I think, in this early period should really be seen as the Zulus of the Mediterranean world. They are a highly militarized society, and like the Zulus, they don't let their warriors have sex, so when they come into battle, they're very tough.
As the army grew, armor became standardized for all soldiers and provided by the state.
I'm wearing a male shirt for body protection, and you can see it's made of small individual pieces of metal which are fashioned into rings and then linked together. Its biggest advantage, of course, is to take slashing blows across. Because the male links all sit together, if an enemy hit me with a sword in a slashing way, it would actually take the blow. The disadvantage of mail was that it doesn't in fact take a stabbing at all. If you stab through the mail, the point of the sword will actually pierce the rings.
Beginning in the 1st century AD, the Romans also used segmented plate armor, held together by leather straps. It was so much more complicated than mail armor that soldiers needed help to put it on.
You can see all the protections on the top rather than around the legs and things. And the reason for that is that when you've got the Celts fighting you with their long slashing swords, you needed all that protection up on the top rather than the bottom. It also gives you a chance to run.
The Roman helmet, gradually redesigned over the centuries, aimed to give maximum protection without blocking the senses.
You can see it's a round bowl protecting the top of my head. Round because it's got very good glancing blow action. A square helmet would take the blow, whereas a round helmet, the blow would glance off. Large cheek pieces to protect the side of my face, and a small neck guard at the back to actually take an overhand blow protecting the back of my neck. Now, obviously, you can see there's no covering on my face or on my ears, in fact. And the Romans decided that it was a lot better for a soldier to be able to see around him and hear orders, very vital in battle.
Further protection came from the Roman shield, smaller and round in early times, developing later into a bigger rectangular one. It was made of layers of wood glued together, bound, and covered with leather and metal.
The thing about the Roman shield is it's curved, not flat like most shields of the time. This gives me protection all around my body. And if I'm coming at you in battle, it's not only a defensive weapon, it's an offensive weapon. I can smash you in the face, and then while you're off balance, draw the sword and in under your ribs.
When it came to offensive weapons, the first one the Roman soldier would use in battle was the javelin.
The great thing about the Roman javelin is, when you threw it, the enemy couldn't throw it back. These are delivered in volleys of hundreds. As they rain down, the hard iron tip will punch through the armor. The weight of the handle will bend this soft metal shank. It'll be useless, you can't throw it back. Your shield is useless, you're probably hurt, you're in big trouble.
But the weapon that won the empire and kept it was the Roman sword.
Once the javelins had been expended, the Roman legion would then move in with probably the most vicious of his weapons, the short sword, or gladius in Latin, very much a close-quarter weapon. It's much shorter than you would envisage a sort of a medieval broadsword to be, because it actually is much shorter. It's designed with a very broad base, tapering to a very, very sharp point. Now, the idea of this weapon was purely to stab. The soldier was trained to actually stab into an enemy soldier, mainly in the stomach area, because, of course, there's no bone for it to actually get jammed in, And of course, a quick stab and withdrawal would put him out of action one way or the other. Now, the soldier was trained not to use an overhand blow, but purely a stabbing action. In the modern way, a soldier uses the bayonet, really.
The thing about this Roman sword is it's shortened to the point and it's used for stabbing rather than slashing.
The barbarians, their swords aren't like ours. They're long and broad, and it's all an ego trip on the battlefield, slashing around above their heads, all style, that's all it is.
And while they're doing that, it's up and under stabbing to the ribs, and so we make mincemeat of the barbarians.
The Roman army was ready to use their weapons and training to build an empire, and the first victims were their fellow Italians. The basic unit of the Roman army was the legion, and over time it became highly structured. Eventually, the legion evolved into a unit of 4,800 soldiers. It was divided into 10 cohorts of 480 men each, which in turn contained 6 centuries. Not 100 men, as you might expect, but 80 soldiers. Each century had 10 groups of 8 men who shared a tent. The legionary commanders were usually political appointments, Roman noblemen doing service as they climbed the political ladder. Their military ability varied greatly, and so much of the real running of the army fell to the officers beneath them. The most famous of these was the centurion, in charge of a century of soldiers. As Rome's empire grew, centurions became career soldiers, working their way up through the ranks. Centurions usually had at least 15 years' experience. It was their job to train the men, discipline them, and lead them in battle.
Because they'd seen so many campaigns, they understood the traditions of the army. They knew how the army could actually solve particular problems which it might encounter in future campaigns. So they were very much the living essence of the Roman legions.
Well, I mean, the equipment of a Roman centurion, you can always immediately tell the centurion because his crest goes across his helmet. In this case, the crest is made of horsehair, though sometimes they were made of feathers. And if he'd been given military awards, you can see they're worn on a harness on the chest.
Centurions were career officers who took the term literally.
Centurions never had to retire. We find some cases of people over 80 still serving. So this, of course, helps to uniformity of standards and training and so on throughout the empire. You see careers of these centurions who've been all over the place in their very long lifetime.
Centurions could make a soldier's life hell. They demanded bribes to excuse soldiers from the less popular duties and used their vine staffs to deliver punishment. One centurion, Lucilius, was nicknamed "Give Me Another" for his practice of breaking his staff over soldiers' backs. He was later murdered by his own men. After its early defeat by Celtic warriors in 390 BC, the Roman army changed its battle tactics. It did away with the rigid phalanx formation it had borrowed from the Greeks and used smaller fighting units called maniples or handfuls, highly maneuverable groups of less than 150 men.
This allowed the Roman army to operate more effectively, perhaps on rather rougher ground, but also it allowed them to move groups of soldiers around to the flanks and to the rear of enemy armies.
While the basis of the Roman army was its infantry, the foot soldier, each legion also had an attachment of up to 300 cavalry. The Romans were not natural horsemen, so they adapted tactics and gear from their enemies, including the Celts. One example was the military saddle.
The saddle on top of it is a very odd-looking beast to most people now. It doesn't look like a modern saddle at all. The most obvious feature are the 4 horns on it, and the 4 horns are there because of the thing that is obviously missing. There are no stirrups at all. The Romans didn't ride with stirrups. The saddle that developed after they'd fought with the Celts had these horns as a very significant feature. If you've got no stirrups, as I said, you can't lean out sideways very safely on a flat saddle. These horns enable you to do that. The saddle looks short compared to a modern saddle because the back horns press against your backside the front horns go under your thigh, and you can lean out probably to about 45 degrees with relative safety.
Part of the cavalry's job was to harass the enemy, and the riders carried special light javelins for that purpose.
As you pass an enemy, you can lob several of them at them. They're not going to do a huge amount of damage, but your purpose isn't necessarily to do a lot of damage, it's to make the formation break up so that the infantry can get in and win.
In battle, the cavalry lined up on the wings of the legions. The infantry formed 3 horizontal lines, so they could take turns at being the front line until the battle was won. As the Romans formed up to start the battle, they banged their swords against their shields in a frightening drum roll until the order came to charge. As the two sides closed in on each other, the Roman front lines would launch their javelins, disrupting the enemy formation. The infantry would form wedges to break up the enemy lines and allow close-in fighting. That was when the short Roman stabbing sword would come into its own.
The fighting itself might be only 20 minutes or so. Sometimes it was a lot longer, but it was very difficult to fight for a great length of time with this massive weight of armour that Roman soldiers and often their enemies wore. Part of the reason for Roman success in battle was undoubtedly to do with training.
Once an enemy cracked, the Romans did not surround them. Instead, they usually left an easy escape route so that the cavalry could come in and cut them down as they fled. By 270 BC, Rome controlled much of the Italian peninsula. But unlike many ancient powers, it did not simply pillage its defeated neighbors, it turned them into allies, sometimes offering them Roman citizenship.
That way, as Rome expands, the people whom it conquers are integrated, form part of the Roman army, and become the troops for the next wave of conquest out. So it's a cumulative process. And that, I think, is key to the success and the growth of this empire.
Rome's expansion made a clash inevitable with Carthage, another Mediterranean superpower. And when that clash came, it would produce the most horrendous war the ancient world had ever seen. Rome's expansion in the 200s BC brought it into conflict with another empire across the Mediterranean. The city of Carthage, in modern-day Tunisia, commanded an empire stretching across northern Africa. In 264 BC, Rome and Carthage began fighting over control of Sicily, where Carthage had colonies. Rome found itself at a disadvantage. Carthage had a great navy, and Rome had almost none. Rome began building one. Its soldiers had never sailed, so they practiced on dry land, pretending to row in unison to get a feel for it. And when it came time for the real sea battles, Rome had a trick up its sleeve. It developed a kind of gangplank called a corvus that hooked onto Carthaginian ships so that the Roman soldiers could board them, turning naval battles into more familiar land battles. And that way, Rome routed the Carthaginian fleet. Rome won Sicily, Corsica, and Sardinia, but Carthage did not accept the defeat. In 218 BC, Carthage hit back under one of the most feared warriors Rome would ever face, Hannibal. And this time, the target was Rome itself.
Hannibal was a man clearly with tremendous determination, a great personal hatred of Rome, which he'd inherited from his family who'd fought the Romans before. And it's also very clear that he had great personal magnetism.
Hannibal marched his army through Spain and France and across the Alps into Italy, accompanied by 36 elephants.
Most of Hannibal's elephants died on the journey over the Alps. In fact, his elephants played absolutely no role in the subsequent campaign. Nevertheless, they represent the skill and boldness that Hannibal portrayed in coming over the Alps so early in the campaigning season and surprising the Romans.
With the help of Celtic warriors who joined him on the way, Hannibal won early victories against Roman legions sent to meet him. Then, in 216 BC, came a major showdown at Cannae in southern Italy. Hannibal had about 40,000 troops, while the Romans and their allies had nearly twice that number. But Hannibal was a master tactician. When the Roman legions made their usual thrust towards his center, Hannibal let them advance, then encircled them. Hannibal had about 40,000 troops, while the Romans and their allies had nearly twice that number. But Hannibal was a master tactician. When the Roman legions made their usual thrust towards his center, Hannibal let them advance, then encircled them. It was a disaster for the Roman army. Some 50,000 Romans and allies were killed. There was panic in Rome, with cries of Hannibal is at the gates. But Hannibal was never able to capture Rome, because Rome's ingenious policy of creating allies paid off once again.
What defeats Hannibal is the fact that the Romans have got 8, 9, 10 times as many men able to be impressed into the army as Hannibal has got. And they can lose 50,000 men in a day. And they keep on fighting because they've got the manpower. And no other state in the ancient world could ever achieve anything like that.
Rome practiced total war against Hannibal. As an emergency measure, it called up every available man, even slaves, and sent legions to Carthage-held Spain to stop supplies and reinforcements from reaching Hannibal.
The wars on this scale are fights for survival, literally for survival. If you lose these kind of wars in the early period, your city is destroyed, your women and children are dispersed across the Mediterranean world. That's the end of it. All societies are destroyed if battles are lost.
It took 15 years of fighting before Hannibal was forced out of Italy. He returned to Carthage to defend it against a counterattack by the Romans, who finally defeated Hannibal in 202 BC. But despite the victory, Rome maintained a paranoid fear of Carthage and provoked a third war in 149 BC. It took the Roman legions 3 years to breach Carthage's huge city walls, and then the Romans slaughtered unknown thousands of Carthaginians and sold 50,000 survivors into slavery. Finally, the Romans leveled the city, plowed it into the ground, and according to legend, sowed it with salt so that nothing would ever grow there again.
Any Roman army was capable of extreme brutality, particularly in the sack of a city which had resisted them, which they then managed to break into. Under those circumstances, it seems to have been normal Roman practice, almost policy, to slaughter absolutely everybody and everything, including animals. Everybody was just chopped to pieces. It was absolute carnage.
After defeating Carthage, Rome also added Greece as a province after destroying the city of Corinth. Many other conquests followed, so that by 100 BC, Rome was undisputed master of the Mediterranean. The Romans justified their expansion in a way that many modern-day politicians would understand.
They always convinced themselves that they fight defensive wars. No Roman war, no matter how offensive or imperialist it might look to us, to the Romans it was always a matter of defense, always fending off an attack. So in a sense, that's how they justified a Mediterranean conquest.
As rulers of a rapidly expanding empire, the legions had to get used to a lot of travel, and that meant travel on foot. When Roman soldiers marched, they carried up to 50 pounds of equipment on their backs, including weapons, armor, cooking utensils, rations, and tools for building a temporary camp. Most armies relied on natural defenses, but the Romans carried the tools to build a new camp wherever they were, a new one each day if necessary. They dug a defensive ditch around the whole camp, 5 feet wide and 3 feet deep, then built a palisade with the stakes they carried with them. It was as though the Romans had their own fortified city wherever they went.
The primary purpose of a Roman marching camp is psychological rather than military. It's the idea that in enemy territory, every night you make a small city in what is not your territory. And the enemy look on, seeing their territory pockmarked by the advance of Roman armies.
The camps were a classic example of the Romans' passion for order. Every camp had an identical plan. Each leather tent was put up in the same position each time, so that the soldiers knew exactly where they were.
The soldiers had a great sense of security during the night. They knew exactly where their officers were, and the fact that their comrades were guarding them as well.
The Roman obsession with order extended to the discipline of the troops. Camp sentries who fell asleep could be stoned to death for having endangered the whole regiment.
It wasn't as exceptional as it might sound, given the general background of what Roman society was like. People were used to flogging, they were used to fairly frequent public executions. So the Roman army was indeed pretty draconian, but not as different from the rest of society as perhaps we might think.
One infamous form of harsh discipline was decimation, the killing of 1 man in 10 of regiments that showed cowardice in battle. The men were selected by lot and clubbed to death by their comrades. Roman obedience was based on fear.
If a Roman soldier was faced by a crisis in battle, that Roman soldier, that unit of soldiers, would stand their ground because they were more likely to survive a desperate fight in battle than to survive if they ran away.
One famous case of decimation came when Roman legions suffered several defeats during a revolt led by an escaped gladiator, a warrior called Spartacus. The Roman army was so busy conquering and building an empire on foreign soil that it had no standing army back home in Italy, and that left it open to surprise attack. That's just what happened in 73 BC, in a revolt led by a foreign slave named Spartacus, who had been forced to become a gladiator.
Conditions for all slaves were relatively cruel and brutal, and particularly for gladiators who were kept chained in barracks and were brutally treated.
Spartacus led a revolt by fellow gladiators against their conditions and was soon joined in the uprising by slaves from the countryside.
Millions of slaves were brought back into Italy, and a lot of them were prisoners of war, a lot of them were ex-warriors. And therefore, although many of them were kept in barracks and many of them were trained to be gladiators, they were a potential security risk.
Because there were no legions stationed in Italy at the time, new legions had to be quickly raised and trained. But Spartacus and his men, using guerrilla tactics, defeated each legion sent to meet him, and his band remained at large in Italy for 3 years. The Roman Senate
armies sent against them. In a sense, their mistake and what lost them their final battle was to behave like Roman soldiers, to fight a conventional pitched battle. Had they stuck to guerrilla warfare, their revolt might have been even more effective than it was.
The legions defeated the rebel army and killed Spartacus, and then Crassus lined the Appian Way outside Rome with 6,000 crucified Spartacans, a lesson to anyone who opposed Rome and her army. In the early days of the Roman army, soldiers were called away for only a few months at a time between spring and harvest. But the expanding empire meant long campaigns overseas, and for property owners, the only men eligible for the were to draw on. And the man who made it possible was the consul Marius, himself a great general. Twice he had saved Rome from invasion with victories over German tribes. In the fields near Aix-en-Provence, they were then given were already looking beyond 3 gold pieces. As the army kept adding new conquests, soldiers were increasingly focused on the spoils of war.
The amount of booty they were able to
make them rich, and the generals, being Roman aristocrats, saw their legions as tickets to wealth and power.
Intimately related as the general and his army. The general promises his army land, booty, settlement after the war has finished. And the army promises the general not only success in conquest, but votes back in Rome afterwards.
This led to a new class of super generals, all with political ambitions. There was Marius himself, a consul for many years. His rival Sulla, who won victories in the eastern Mediterranean and became dictator of Rome for a time. Pompey the Great, who conquered Syria and Palestine. And the most famous general of all, Julius Caesar.
Julius Caesar represents as close as I think you can get to naked ambition in the 1st century BC. There's a famous story of Julius Caesar, aged 31, in further Spain, coming across a statue of that great conqueror Alexander the Great, and suddenly bursting into tears. And his entourage say, "Why, Caesar, are you crying?" And he says, "This man, by my age, had conquered most of the world, and I have done nothing."
Within a few years, the world would know that Caesar had done a great deal. Of all Rome's great generals, none created more fame, bloodshed, loyalty, and hatred than Julius Caesar. He was a nobleman who worked his way up the political ladder and used his military command in Spain to pillage enough booty to buy votes in Rome. He was made a consul and formed a political alliance, the Triumvirate, with a rival general Pompey and Marcus Crassus, the richest man in Rome. Caesar then had himself made governor of northern Italy and southern France, which made him commander of several legions. He was anxious for more conquests, and his chance soon came. In 58 BC, a Celtic people, the Helvetii, asked Caesar's permission to migrate from Switzerland to western France, across Roman allies' territory in what was then called Gaul. Instead of agreeing, Caesar decided to attack.
Caesar, of course, is a cynic. He needs a war, he needs the booty derived from that to finance his political campaigns. Before he goes on campaign in Gaul, he is deeply in debt. Gaul will provide the booty for repaying his creditors.
Caesar sent 6 legions against the Helvetii, 360,000 men, women, and children. More than half the Helvetii were slaughtered, and the survivors forced to return to their homelands.
Was a part of the political struggle at Rome in the late Republic. Pompey, his great rival, was Rome's best general. So Caesar, competing against Pompey, he has to be a better general.
After dispatching the Helvetii, Caesar set after a German tribe that had crossed the Rhine and marched his troops 120 miles in 5 days to the Alsace region. Again, the Romans slaughtered thousands. Caesar then turned west towards Belgium and repeated the dose against the tribe there. Caesar's political foes in Rome decried his actions, but most Romans cheered him on because he was defeating Gauls, the very same Celtic people who'd sacked Rome in 390 BC. The Romans' fear of Celtic peoples, like the Gauls, was more than historical. It was also physical.
Partly the sheer size of the Celts. The Italians were a fairly small people, and compared to them, the Gauls, for example, were absolutely enormous, sort of 6-footers, that the Italians weren't used to. For example, we're told that Julius Caesar was tall for a Roman, he was only 5'6".
To the Romans, anyone who didn't speak Latin or Greek, such as the Celts, was looked down upon as a barbarian because their language sounded like sheep. Ba, ba.
The Romans have a very particular view of themselves, and that is to see themselves as people who've developed the powers of the mind to control the body. Barbarians, on the other hand, are people who are led by physical desire, sex and drugs and rock and roll. They don't have a proper education, so they go for the nearest thrill.
But the Celts that Caesar was fighting in Gaul were far from barbarians as we know the term. They lived in organized towns, like this reconstruction. Far from barbarians as we know the term. They lived in organized towns, like this reconstruction in France, and they were master ironworkers who probably invented the chain-mail armor that the Romans gained legions. Celtic warriors did not fight as a unit. They fought for individual glory.
The big men liked to show up dressed in fancy, shiny armor, stand at the front, and engage in warfare that was no doubt fairly brutal, but was fairly small scale. They couldn't plan total war in the way that the Romans could plan. They didn't have fully trained legions. They didn't have logistic backup.
Also, the Celts were up against a brilliant commander in Julius Caesar. He was ambitious, hungry for victories, and used daring and original tactics.
He was noted for the speed and surprise of his movements, and he really brought those techniques to perfection in using his legions. On the other hand, he was a little reckless. Part of his daring.
Boys, you're all going to be cavalry. Suddenly has 5,000 cavalry.
Caesar knew he asked a lot of his soldiers, and so he went out of his way to cultivate an intense loyalty from them.
He didn't ask them to do anything that he didn't do, and he often dismissed his bodyguard and had his horse led away and actually stood in the ranks with the troops. And his troops were very loyal to him.
Not surprisingly, these loyal soldiers were also becoming wealthy soldiers through booty and slaves. The spoils of war were often won through great brutality. Caesar himself boasted that his campaigns in Gaul left 1 million dead and 1 million enslaved.
Caesar just carried out what I've called actually a big game hunt. He took his legions back and forth across Gaul, slaughtering troops, pillaging towns, killing women, children. The Romans were terribly cruel on the Celts.
Defeated enemies were often made into slaves. Slavery was tremendously important to Rome. 40% of the Italian population were slaves, the same percentage as the American South before the Civil War.
Slaves are fundamental to Rome's war effort. Essentially, slaves free the Roman citizen to fight in the army. Without slavery, it would have been impossible for Rome so effectively to initiate these wars of conquest.
Caesar's wars of conquest went on for 9 years. He was the ultimate example of everything the Roman army had become in its first 500 years. Dedicated, ambitious, ruthless. And Caesar would not stop with foreign conquests. With his army behind him, he would conquer his enemies in Rome and take the title of dictator for life.
There could be nothing more brutal. The power of the ancient world brought to its knees by... Since 1875, a monument to the victor dominates the landscape. Last hero. This is his story. Julius Caesar gave the same name to all the tribes in the inaccessible regions east of the Rhine, Germani. They were forever making incursions into Roman territory. Even before the birth of Christ, Augustus Caesar decided to protect the exposed eastern flank of the empire in Gaul. In a series of campaigns, the Germanic tribes were to be subdued. Some put up a struggle. Others, like the Cherusci, allied themselves with Rome. His life is changed forever. Arminius is of noble blood. His father, Segimerus, belongs to Cheruscan aristocracy. But Segimerus is firmly opposed to the alliance with Rome. The nobles have chosen Segestes as the leader of their clan. Segimerus must accept his leadership and his decisions. But Segestes is not welcome in this company. Segestes has chosen the alliance with Rome, and now he has come to fulfill the conditions of the alliance. He has come for Segimerus' sons. They must be handed over to the occupiers at once. It is, he says, a necessary sacrifice that must be made for the good of the whole tribe. It means that Segimerus may never see the boys again. They will become Romans. Taking hostages was a favorite Roman ploy. Chiefs like Segestes were their agents, with everything to gain from cooperating.
We know relatively little about the early history of the Cherusci. They suddenly turn up in the time of Augustus. For a while they were Rome's enemies, but then they formed an alliance with Rome. Segestes was the leading figure among the Cherusci at the time of the Roman conquest. When a colossal superpower like Rome collides with a relatively small tribe, it's not really surprising if part of the clan, or the whole tribe, decide to form an alliance with the enemy.
Everything we know about the Germans comes from ancient Roman texts. Writers like Paterculus, Tacitus, or Cassius Dio used accounts by Roman soldiers returning from Germania. The Germanic tribes had no writing, so they have left no version of the story of Arminius. Arminius and his brother Flavius, the Fair One, will be brought up as Romans, so they can return to their homeland one day as representatives of Roman power. To the Romans, this seems a sure way to consolidate their control. Who else can they trust when families and clans among their Cheruscan allies are split between the enemies and friends of Rome? But it's misleading even to speak of a unified people and call them Germans. There are dozens of tribes constantly fighting each other. For the Romans, this really is a terra incognita, an unknown world.
From the Roman point of view, they were entering a territory of a sort they had never conquered before. Gaul had a quite different structure. It was Celtic, it already had permanent towns, and its tribes were much more hierarchically stable than tribes in Germania.
The Germanic people live for themselves, separated from each other, said the Roman historian Tacitus. The bigger settlements numbered up to 25 houses, with humans and animals living under the same roof. Towns and cities like those in the rest of the empire are unknown here. And for the Romans, the people are uncivilized savages living more like animals than humans. Tacitus tells us they live in a wild landscape between the rivers Rhine and Elbe, a landscape covered with vast, dense forests of oak and birch. The place Tacitus describes is deeply foreign. The marshes that cover this territory are repulsive. The forests make one shiver with fear.
What disturbed the Romans most was that there were no roads, no trade routes, and there were no fixed points to aim for, no castles or strongholds to take, just this dreadful forest that took 9 days to cross without encountering a single human being. It was a nightmare for the Romans.
The impenetrable forests were totally unsuited to Roman military tactics and logistics. Being sent to Germania in the freezing north was seen by most Roman soldiers as a punishment. And they were scared because they had never seen forests. After centuries of building Roman cities and naval fleets, there were scarcely any forests left in Italy. They were stationed in northern Europe. They knew they didn't belong here. Julius Caesar wrote, "Even if they walk for 60 days, no one can say they have come to the end of this forest. And no one can even know where it ends."
Throughout the Mediterranean region, Rome had an urban culture. They lived in towns, and compared to that, what they found in Germania was very primitive. It was simple. The basic elements of Roman civilization and achievements were missing. It was a real collision of two cultures.
For Arminius and Flavius, their route towards the Roman world would have taken them first through the forests to the River Rhine. This is where the Roman world began. Where the first solid evidence of Rome's engineering mastery was a great fortress and a bridge spanning the river. From this army camp at Vetera, many thousands of legionaries protect Rome's frontier along the river. It's only one of many camps along the Rhine. The Romans founded cities like Cologne, Koblenz and Mainz, shop windows for Roman civilization. But the message they give is not keep away. They're a magnet for the barbarians, who engage in flourishing trade with the Romans. Long blonde hair is especially valuable. The Germans accept coins they've never seen before for their hides and furs. Tribesmen with nothing to sell work as laborers for the Romans. It's a tempting new world.
It must have made an incredibly powerful impression on the Germanic tribesmen. The way the Romans built their towns, the complicated organization behind it, their skill at calculation and measurement, their skill at providing a supply of running water. All that would have made an enormous impression. You can imagine the tribesmen standing there open-mouthed. They must have been absolutely astounded.
The separation from his family must have been painful for Arminius. But there were plenty of new impressions to distract him. And the barbarian brothers will have been an attraction in their own right. The sons of nobles get privileged treatment. Including their first miraculous experience of heated floors. This is the journey of a lifetime, up the river Moselle, through the cities of the Roman province of Gaul, then across the Mediterranean to the capital city of the ancient world.
It was a popular tactic for the Romans. They brought nobles' sons to Rome and educated them at the prince's school on the Palatine Hill. They served two purposes. On the one hand, they were hostages, guaranteeing the good behavior of their fathers, but on the other hand, they were brought up as Romans. And when they went back to their own people, they were expected to behave as Romans. It would have been like that with Arminius, because when he was a boy, the Romans were certainly taking noble hostages in Germania.
Arminius and Flavius may have reached Rome about 9 BC. First they passed the workers' stone tenements in the teeming suburbs. Then they neared the center of the biggest city in the world with its 1 million inhabitants. Arminius arrives in a city that is flourishing as never before. Great parade routes crisscross the city. Marble glistens in the Mediterranean sun. There had never been a longer period of peace, and never had the Roman Empire been as big as it was under the Emperor Augustus.
Under Augustus, the Roman Empire had expanded to a size it had never known before. And Augustus extended the Roman Empire far further than any single Roman had done before him. Just think about it. Northern Spain, the Alps, great swathes of territory as far as the Danube, Inner Anatolia, Judea, Egypt, Africa. He added all this to the Roman Empire. It reached an enormous geographical span. And yet later, the time of Augustus would be associated with peace. And that's because he made peace in Rome after decades of civil war, Roman against Roman. But in his foreign policy, Augustus was anything but an emperor of peace. He waged war non-stop throughout his reign.
Eigentlich dauernd, ununterbrochen Krieg geführt. As a young man, Arminius becomes part of Rome's gigantic war machine. He soon grasps the key to Rome's military success: discipline. It can't have been easy for a Cheruscan to submit to strict drill and unquestioning obedience. Germanic warriors reject firm leadership. But Arminius proves an excellent pupil. A young man quick to pick things up and unusually talented for a German is a contemporary verdict. This Cheruscan is turning into the perfect Roman soldier.
This education of a Germanic tribesman in the Roman Empire always had two sides. A technical side, how do I lead an army, what weapons do I carry, and an ideological side, politics and Rome as one and the same thing. Rome as the ideal we should worship, and the Romans combined them.
Around 1 BC, Arminius receives his first posting, to Pannonia in the Balkans. He's a captain of the Auxilia, a mounted force of Germanic mercenaries. Tribes in this Balkan province have risen against Rome. Rome hits back hard, sending 15 legions, more than 100,000 men, half the entire army, to crush the rebels. It's a show of the absolute superiority of Roman military tactics.
Fire! Fire! Fire!
Roman power lies not in the courage of individual soldiers, but in the strategic cooperation of military units. Arminius will never forget this lesson. In open warfare, Rome is invincible.
Two different ways of waging war meet head-on here. The Roman army is professional and disciplined. Different ranks have precisely defined skills and roles. Each man knows he can do this or that. He commands so many men, and he has the means and equipment to do this or that. For the Germans, however, this was a relationship that had grown together between chiefs and nobles and selected warriors who would cross from tribe to tribe, who had sworn allegiance to those chiefs. In their own way, the warriors were professionals too. It was a personal relationship. And in some ways, of course, it also instilled discipline. That is, it was a question of honor. And it was a situation in which they were attached to this one man and they owed him allegiance.
The Romans advanced in a closed formation called the tortus. The barbarians attacked in a wedge-shaped formation called the boar's head. the force of the impact is only momentarily effective. The armored legions can mow down their attackers. Ranks so tightly closed, they function like a single body. We don't know exactly what Arminius did in the Pannonian War, but he must have fought with distinction. Back in Rome, the Emperor Augustus makes him a knight, the highest honor open to a member of a Germanic tribe. A noble son from the forests of Germania has become a respected citizen of Rome. "15 years since he left home. Impossible to say whether he misses his family, the freedom, the endless forests. Impossible to say what ambitions he holds today."
We know
of many cases where Germanic tribesmen in the service of Rome learned how to behave in the Roman way without feeling Roman or becoming loyal to Rome.
Und Rom die Treue zu halten.
It's not easy to make people genuinely committed to a system that may bring them great privileges, but also requires a change of identity. Not everyone can do that.
In the year 7 AD, Augustus appoints a new governor for Germania. He's a relative called Publius Quinctilius Varus. He's described as physically corpulent and spiritually complacent. And yet, Varus has proved himself in a crisis. He crushed a Jewish revolt as governor in Syria, crucifying 2,000 rebels. He came into this rich province a poor man, and he left this poor province a rich man, they said later. In his glory days, coins were minted with his likeness, a rare privilege.
Varus had the skills and experience a Roman senator selected for that job in Germania would need. And Augustus would certainly not have sent someone there just because he was a relative, unless he was also convinced that he had the experience to carry out what was expected of him.
But then, Augustus makes a decision with unforeseen consequences. He sends Arminius to Germania at Varus's side. It's a decision that will have pleased Varus. Arminius has the reputation of being brave, disciplined, and loyal. And he knows the Cherusci and their fighting style. He speaks their language. In 7 AD, Arminius comes back to his homeland. Over the past 15 years, the Romans have surged on, building up their new province, constructing camps along the rivers Rhine, Main, and Lippe to consolidate their control in Germania Magna. Haltern on the Lippe is their administrative center, the capital of the new province. Close to today's Roman Museum at Haltern, they create a base for 3 legions, a total of 20,000 men. There are barracks, smithies for making weapons, kilns for pottery, and villas for the high officials. And on the Lippe is a harbour for the supply of Roman goods and luxuries that make life bearable in these barbarian lands.
Right from the beginning, the Romans tried to give the impression that they had subdued Germania
besiegt sei.
In his last will and testament, Augustus wrote, "I have conquered Germania as far as the mouth of the Elbe." Whenever a general won a little victory in Germania, he would call himself Germanicus, as if to say he had the Germanic tribes under control. The Romans minted coins showing Germania as a woman sitting on the ground in mourning with a broken spear, so ordinary Romans really would have got that impression. But Tacitus contradicted that. He said, that's nonsense. Germania has not been defeated. The Germanic tribes are living just as they did 200 years ago, completely free.
On his return, Arminius may have looked in vain for the signs of Roman domination. Some distance from the Roman forts, the advanced Roman way of life is nowhere to be seen. The uniform of a Roman soldier. Arminius must have paid lip service to the image brought by Rome by being part of the empire. The wealth, skills, and like the grapes for their sour wine, counting them like cattle to levy taxes, and Etruscans are condemned to a life of slavery. Their freedom is lost. But not all Germanic tribesmen insist, like Segumerus, on freedom and independence. On the river Lahn, near the small town of Waldgirmes, archaeologists have made a remarkable discovery. When Roman remains were found here in 1993, they thought it was just another army camp. The Romans said they'd built proper towns east of the Rhine, but the experts had always dismissed it as propaganda. But now there was evidence of something more. This is a civilian town. So far, the only Roman town discovered on this side of the Rhine. This was planned to be used by Romans and Germans. Roman historian Cassius Dio described the strategy behind it. By building forums, houses, and baths, the defeated peoples were seduced into peace. And then, archaeologists put together conclusive proof of Rome's attitude to its newly conquered territory.
We were really surprised when we found fragments gilded on one side with gold leaf. We soon realized that they must be parts of a bronze statue. But when we found a stirrup, a part of a harness and a horse's hoof, we said to ourselves, this is an equestrian statue. And of course, the size of the parts made it clear how big the whole statue was. It was life-size. And since it was gilded, a statue at that time and at that place could only have been a statue of the Emperor Augustus.
This golden monument stood in the Forum.
The fact there was a gilded, life-size equestrian statue in Waldgirmes shows the Romans clearly making their claim to the territory, above all to the local population. You have to imagine how it would have looked to a local tribesman, standing in the Forum, looking at this glistening gold statue of a horse and rider with a realistic portrait of the emperor. It must have seemed utterly amazing to him.
Varus must have expected to find Germania already pacified when he arrived at Haltern and met Arminius. Varus is tasked with turning Germania into a fully fledged Roman province. Arminius's assessment of the situation is invaluable. But a mere captain of the auxiliary cavalry would never tell his general what to do. Varus insists. A German knows how to deal with Germans. He knows how to bring them into the empire. The blood in my veins may be German, Arminius says. My head and my tongue are Roman. Then Arminius must act like a Roman, Varus says. And Arminius is given his first mission. The legions are about to set out for their summer camp. Arminius is to reconnoiter the route. To demonstrate their dominance, the Romans moved troops eastwards every summer. From their strongholds on the Rhine and the Lippe towards the river Weser, home to the Cherusci. Traveling through this uncharted wilderness is a daunting task. There are no roads of any kind. To transport their troops and keep them supplied, the Romans are forced to use the river Lippe. They've even developed a special boat for the purpose. It's a 30-meter flat-bottomed barge with a draft of only 40 centimeters. It can sail in shallow waters, carrying a load of 53 tons. With hundreds of these barges, Varus advances deep into Germania until the river is too narrow. The cargo is transferred to land. There's massive amounts of material. The legions travel with civilian support: blacksmiths, carpenters, tax collectors, many with their families. Then there are the merchants with wine and olives. The little luxuries from back home that make life bearable for Romans in the chilly, savage north. The auxilia, mounted Germanic mercenaries, are to scout and secure the route. Arminius is their commander. A total of 22,000 people stretching for 15 kilometers, forcing their way across the plain. The soldiers marched in 4 columns. Every legion had a baggage train carrying its equipment. The whole column could cover on average 20 kilometers a day. The legions were aiming for an area close to today's Minden. Even today it has a Latin name, Porta Westphalica. This is where the river Weser cuts through the Vienne and Weser hills. For a long time, the exact location of Varus's summer camp was not known. But in 2008, archaeologists discovered Roman remains in a village near the river Weser. It's early days yet, but finds like these suggest this was a military base, perhaps Varus's summer encampment. Here's a peg from a legionary's tent. From his new forward position, Varus decides to impose Roman law on the barbarians. A people not subdued in battle may be controlled by the strict application of justice. But But is this really the right time? Historian Velleius Paterculus has his doubts. He writes, Varus gave the Germans orders as if they already lived in slavery. He demanded tributes as if they were subjects. The tax collectors become notorious for demanding that the exact amounts of the different commodities are paid. The rules apply to everyone, without exception or delay.
Good.
But the Roman tax authorities are disappointed by what they can drum up in Germanic villages. This land barely provides a surplus. The Germanic tribes are subsistence farmers. When their limited produce is confiscated, their frustration at Roman rule turns to hatred. And Roman law just makes things worse. For one person to judge between two parties in a dispute goes deeply against the Germanic sense of justice. It has been the privilege of the old Germanic nobles to negotiate between themselves matters of justice. The worst transgression? Varus condemns natives to be crucified for theft. In the Germanic world, only the gods hold sway over the life and death of a free man. Theft, even murder, are atoned by paying a fine known as the Wehrgeld.
Lass mich los! Loslassen!
But Varus ignores the sacred Germanic traditions.
The way Varus behaved in Germania was not so different from Roman policy elsewhere in the empire. He had to try to introduce Roman law because that was part of life in a Roman province. And if the Germanic peoples didn't like it, then that was a perfectly normal reaction on their part. Just think of today how people hate it when they find themselves being judged or imprisoned by a foreign power. Every community will try to resist when strangers come and try to impose their own form of justice.
Wenn Fremde kommen und sich als Richter oben hinstellen.
Varus brutally suppresses any sign of unrest. The ringleaders are executed, their villages burned. What does Arminius make of this? He remembers his people as proud, free warriors. On his return, he finds them powerless, impotent, and demoralized, oppressed by the very power he himself represents. Perhaps no other choice is possible. He turns against Rome. Historians still dispute exactly why Arminius did it. The Roman sources tell us nothing. But maybe it's not difficult to understand.
Arminius
must have had experiences that led him to this change of heart. Rome had never completely replaced the Cheruscan world in his loyalties. He would have been tugged both ways when he made his decision.
Beide Wurzeln lebten in ihm, als seine Entscheidung gefällt hat. Und die römische Welt.
He must have been deeply fascinated by Rome, and he'd absorbed from it everything he'd need to carry out his plan.
Was für sein aktuelles Handeln dann
He used that and he combined it with his Germanic Cheruscan heritage to turn it against Rome.
Durch die germanisch-cheruskische Welt zusammen eben gegen Rom zu wenden.
Rome, which he now felt could no longer be the future for his people.
Nicht mehr geheuer war für die Zukunft seines Stammes.
But maybe Arminius had selfish reasons to betray Rome. Any claim he might have to leadership of his own tribe had suffered by his proximity to Varus. Leading a successful revolt against Rome would give him enormous credit with all the Germanic peoples. Quite likely, Arminius had the ambition of becoming king of the Germanic peoples, something there had never been. According to this theory, he acted out of this strange combination of local patriotism and a distinctly Roman lust for power.
Indem ich gegen die Römer kämpfe, meine Leute hinter mich scharen.
If I fight against the Romans with my own people behind me, I can build up a powerful independent position that would never have been possible as a follower of the Romans. I would always be their puppet. And he certainly had a very strong lust for power. So this personal impulse, you could say it was a struggle for freedom at the same time if you want to, he was using this impulse to create his own kingdom, his own empire, an Arminius empire. Then it's certainly no coincidence that he was later murdered by his own people because, in some ways, he was an enemy of Germanic freedom.
Behind the backs of the Romans, Arminius calls the Germanic tribes together to test out their loyalty. He has to persuade them that he possesses the Heil of a successful military leader. For the Germanic peoples, Heil is the highest form of good fortune. He who earns it or is granted it by the gods will succeed in whatever he undertakes. And his Heil is then shared with everyone who follows him. But it won't be easy to unite the Germanic tribes behind one goal. They prefer warring against each other. The worst enemy of a Germanic tribe is another Germanic tribe. There are tribal leaders who have been showered with gold and privileges by the Romans in exchange for their loyalty. One of these is Segestes, a relative of Arminius. Segestes has been elected leader of the Cherusci. Segestes tries hard to persuade his fellow tribal leaders that it would be suicidal to rise up against Varus and the legions. In every uprising until now, the Romans have been victorious, the tribes have been crushed. The revenge of the Romans has been terrible. To attack them again would only bring the same result again. Only this time, their reprisals will be even more brutal. A Roman prefect like Arminius should know better than anyone that the Romans are invincible. It's Arminius the Roman who reminds his people that they are living in slavery. That the weapons and symbols of occupation the slaughter will break on. Varus's legions are getting ready to return to their winter quarters on the Rhine. Arminius begins to play a dangerous double game. He's preparing a plan to attack Varus's